All right, guys. So, as a class, we're about to start a new unit focusing on the Russian Revolution and a couple other communist revolutions that took place in Asia um, prior to World War II. But before we get too far, I just want to make note of this. So, Russia was one of Europe's last true autocracies, and we'll talk about what that word means and then ultimately why, after Russia collapsed after the Communist Revolution, how it became the 20th century's really first true dictatorial state in Europe. So, we did this activator in class. You guys had some interesting answers, so we don't need to spend any time there. So, we'll start here. As I mentioned previously, Russia was an autocracy. And if you think about all the other words that start with autotroph, um, anything else like that, they create their own power, their own food. So an autocracy is a style of government similar to a monarchy, but the important piece is that the ruler gets its authority basically from themselves. So prior to the revolution, the czarist system made it so that there was no representative political institution. So in other words, the people did not represent themselves at all in the government, and the rulers believed that they got their authority actually from God. And you can think back to what you studied in middle school and find a lot of other examples, like in Egypt and dynastic China, that had similar understandings for where power and authority came from. So this is definitely like a pre-Enlightenment theory that existed well after the Enlightenment. So Alexander III actually made the autocratic control even greater than it was previously. A couple of the things that he did included mandating one state religion, avoid having any religious division amongst the people, use Jews as scapegoats for the country's problems, and that deflected attention away from the government, using a secret police force to observe any treasonous or rebellious activity. And I put the word treasonous in quotation marks because that could mean whatever the powers that be decided it meant. And then to finally control education completely. Stalin, who we'll learn about shortly, had a pretty interesting theory about the human mind. And his principle was it's easier to build a mind than it is to change a mind. So you'll see a lot of these regimes that have authoritarian tendencies. They tend to focus very heavily on education because they want to basically start them young. And then finally, all of the other national groups that existed within the empire, their individual free expression, language, religious traditions were all suppressed. The idea being total control and authority of the people from top to bottom would allow for an autocratic ruler to maintain power and authority for as long as they chose. Just to give you an idea, when over the next couple of weeks we use the right, the left, we're talking about a political spectrum. This is a linear political spectrum, and it shows the groups that we're about to start focusing on, the communists, the Marxist, they exist on the left of the spectrum. But you'll hear a lot of political ideologues actually say that it's not quite a linear perspective. It's more of like a horseshoe. Sometimes you'll hear that's one theory, but whatever the case is, we as a class are going to analyze that. So don't get too caught up into it right yet. All right. These next couple slides are not going to be in your notes, so just follow along with me. Just a quick crash course reviewing some of the things that we've already discussed. So Russia, as we've mentioned previously, was well behind other European countries in terms of industrialization for most of the 19th century. But towards the turn of the century, they started to make significant gains. So, for example, by 1900, Russia was number 4 in steel production, not only in Europe, but in the world, which was pretty significant considering how far behind they were previously. However, what this resulted in was some pretty harsh and cruel working conditions, and the wealth that was created tended to only congregate towards the very top, which happens in any given society, including communist, as we'll come to see. But some workers became more, I guess the term that you would use today would be woke, reading works from people like Karl Marx, who we've discussed before. They started to think that, well, this is what Marx was talking about. We, the proletariat have to rise up and create a dictatorship of the workers. We've got to basically overthrow those people who are exploiting our labor and services. So the leader who rose to this top was a guy named Vladimir Lenin, who had been exiled prior to World War I for his quote-unquote treasonous activities. If I remember correctly, yes, his brother had been executed for his own treasonous activities, and Lenin went abroad to organize his thoughts and, in many ways, eventually organize the revolution that we're about to learn about. So Russia was involved in a handful of wars prior to World War I. Some of the people rose up against their government. This is a pretty famous painting here that depicts a moment called Bloody Sunday. A group of poor workers congregated in front of the palace where the Tsar lived, and the Tsar ordered his officers out there, and they ended up actually mowing down a lot of those protesters with their guns. And that was a significant turning point because it showed the government physically turning its weaponry against its people. So when World War I came along, that ended up being the final straw. Russian people were dying, as we've seen in some of our data points in class, more than any other country involved in the war. So eventually the people themselves pushed hard enough back against the Tsar, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate, and the Russians backed out of the war early. In class, we're going to investigate. This is just showing the young man that would be forced out on the front to go fight. We're going to be investigating this guy, Rasputin, tomorrow. He's a little bit of a cliff note in history, not a cliff note, a footnote in history, but a very important one that we're going to investigate. And it's kind of a cool story nonetheless. He was a spiritual advisor to the Tsar and the Tsarina, and a lot of revolutionaries thought that he had too much control over them. So back to the notes. So the Soviets, which were groups of workers within the Russian country, many of them started to rally behind the Bolsheviks, which were led by Lenin. And their slogan, or his slogan, was peace, land, and bread. And if you think back to some of the other revolutions that we've talked about this year, like take, for example, the French Revolution, I bet you can remember the three-word motto amongst the radicals then, right? Liberté, égalité, fraternity. Simple, poignant solutions to complicated problems are often very, very attractive. So the Bolsheviks kicked out the government that had replaced the Tsar, and basically took control of the war efforts, pulled the Russian people out of World War I, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And in doing so, they actually lost land to the Germans. Then Russia, like a lot of places at the height of revolution, devolved into a civil war. Different groups had different visions for what the country should become. So you ended up having a group of white Russians fighting a group of red Russians, who were the Bolsheviks. The Americans, speaking of footnotes in history, actually supported the whites, because even back then, there was a very heavy anti-communist bias from the American people. So President Woodrow Wilson authorized a lot of our troops supporting the whites. Ultimately, their efforts failed. Lenin was able to actually defeat the whites. He consolidated power amongst himself and a few Bolsheviks that surrounded him. He created his new economic plan, which in many ways was a moderate version of communism. It actually had some versions of private ownership of capital within it. So in other words, it was a mix between capitalism and communism in some ways. He tore down a lot of the old systems under the Tsar. And in fact, as one real final blow to the old system, he even changed the name of the state. It went from being called Russia to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So kind of like the United States is a collection of independent political entities, Lenin was making an allusion towards that idea. And then finally, the Bolshevik Party became the Communist Party.